There have been two visions of church-state relations encapsulated in those men. There is the vision of Constantine, theocracy, a government that has a favorite religion, a government that promotes that religion, a government that treats you like a second-class citizen or actively persecutes you if you don't agree with that religion. That's Constantine's vision. Madison's vision was, of course, quite different. Freedom of conscience for all, secular government resting on a wall of separation between church and state, broad philosophical and religious freedom for everybody. And when you look at those two visions, when you think about those two visions, it's pretty clear that one is better than the other. But the strangest thing about our society and about our history is that there have always been those among us who prefer the vision of Constantine over the vision of Madison. And they haven't been shy about telling us that. They've been very vocal, they've been very active politically, and many of them hold power today. But lately, I think they've been a little trouble. Their world has changed. Our world has changed. And this has led to what I like to think of as a crisis of faith. Not in faith, but of faith. And what I mean by that is that the crisis of faith is not necessarily what you think. It has many manifestations. I'll give you a couple of examples. Religious organizations in this country have a long history of paying their own way, sort of blazing their own trail. And they have been very proud about that. But lately, we're hearing a different type of talk. People say things like, well, we built this thing, we built up this edifice, we built this church, we built this religious community, but we're having trouble maintaining it. Or it's broken and we want you to help us fix it. And you need to help us support this religion. That didn't used to be the line that they used. That didn't used to be what they said. They were proud of what they had built. They were proud to support it themselves. They didn't want government to do it for them. They didn't want the state or the taxpayer to support their religion. And beyond just physical structures, we can see this argument playing out many other ways. Religious organizations saying that their prayers should dominate at government meetings, even though those meetings are supposed to represent us all. Religious organizations saying that their symbols should dominate the public square. Their symbols and only their symbols. And that they should represent all people. And in case of war memorials, a cross can represent all of our war dead, even though we know they weren't all Christians. The guiding principle used to be, we will support our faith on our own. And they took a certain joy and pleasure in that. We built this thing, we're proud of it. But now too many are saying, well, we built it, as I said a minute ago, we broke it, we need your help with it. And an interesting example of that we're seeing play out right now is with Roman Catholic education. The Catholic school system has been challenged as of late because of some cultural trends and some demographic trends. Let me give you a couple examples. Catholic schools recently have been closing in New York City. 24 schools closed there. Buffalo, 10. Chicago, Providence, Philadelphia, other cities they've been closing. In 1960, there were 5.2 million youngsters attending Catholic schools, about 13,000 Catholic schools, 1960. 2006, which was the most recent figure I could find, 2 million children attending Catholic schools, 6,600 schools. So that's quite a drop, as you can see there. Where I grew up, in a city of about 60,000 people in western Pennsylvania with a strong Irish Catholic tradition, we had 4 Catholic schools in our community. Well, now they're down to 1 in that town. Well, what happened? That pattern playing out all over the country. Well, a number of things happened. People looked at the cost of this school system. They said, well, I've got a perfectly good public school system here. I'd rather not pay for that. Or I'd rather put that money into a college fund for my child because, as we all know, the cost of a college education is continuing to escalate. But I think more interestingly is, one thing that happened is people simply started to say, we don't have to listen to the bishop. Just because the bishop says you're supposed to send your children to Catholic schools, we don't necessarily have to listen to that. When I was a kid, if the bishop said, you sent your children to Catholic school, that was the end of the discussion. you sent your children to Catholic school, even if you had the stretch to do it. And that is playing out in lots of different ways, not only in the Catholic Church, but in many others as well. To look at that church again, when I was a kid, if the bishop said, don't use birth control, a lot of women would listen to that and follow that rule. But now they're not necessarily following it anymore. In fact, the number of Catholic women using birth control is pretty much mirroring the general population. It's in the high 90s. So we see an extension of that into social policy. People basically saying, I'm not leaving my faith, I'm not discarding it, but I don't necessarily feel like I have to listen to every little dogmatic point anymore. Now, what has been the reaction of conservative religious communities to that type of thinking? That thinking that says, yeah, I respect you, I still like you, but I'm not going to listen to everything you tell me to do. What has been a reaction of the more conservative religious communities? Well, it hasn't been to go back and look at their theology and say, well, gee, what should we do differently? How can we make a more attractive message? How can we get people to listen? What can we change? That has not been their response. Their response has been, we have failed to persuade you, so now we'll force you. And we see this play out on issues like access to birth control, LGBT rights, creationism and the role of science in our public school system, censorship, and compelled worship and prayer. And if you think about all these issues and others that we're dealing with right now, that we're grappling with on the church-state scene, one thing that ties them all together is that someone else wants to make a decision for you. It's very, very discouraging. And another thing that's very discouraging is that those who hold to a confident faith don't feel the need to use the government to impose it on others. They persuade by example. Now the problem is, in the case of extremely conservative religious groups, or the religious right, whatever you want to call them, that their examples aren't very good. I mean, I've observed these organizations over the years. I've been to some of their meetings. I've read their magazines, looked at their websites, I've argued with them on television. And what have I seen? Well, I've seen a lot of anger and bitterness. I've seen a lot of conspiracy theory thinking, division. I've seen hate and rage. And I've seen fear of anybody who's sort of deemed to be the other, a threat to the way of we do things around here. And that type of mindset, that type of thinking, is being so challenged today that they are very afraid, because the country is changing in many ways. Changing demographically, changing culturally, and changing even its religious complexion. And the religious complexion is the one that's, I think, the most interesting, the most important for the issues we're discussing here tonight. Well, what's happening with the changing face of American religion? It is important because it plays into these questions of separation of church and state. Well, people are not abandoning their faith. I mean, America has always been a country with an interest in religious things. We're not like Western Europe, even though culturally we have a lot in common with them. In Western Europe, you will see the church attendance rates dropping very steadily. People losing interest, people saying that they're no longer particularly religious, more people adopting the label of non-religious, agnostic, atheist, humanist. Not really happening here. The numbers of non-believers have certainly ticked up a little bit, but by and large, people are still interested in religion. But what they are not so much interested in, or increasingly becoming less interested in, is adhering step by step, word by word, to a rigid dogma laid down by some cleric somewhere who says it's been revealed to him because he interpreted a holy book. So this new sort of complexion, this new way of thinking about religion, it doesn't necessarily reject all tradition, but it simply listens more to a voice that's coming from within inside, as opposed to clerics. It considers ancient holy books, interesting. Maybe there's some history in there. Maybe there are some moral lessons, but they're not necessarily guidebooks for how to live your life today. This new complexion is more tolerant, and its credo is increasingly live and let live. And, most interestingly, it dares to suggest that for those who believe in an afterlife, there may be more than one path there. And it blends traditions. Increasingly, a lot of people will say, I was raised in this church, but now I find wisdom in this other system. Or my spouse belongs to this other tradition, and we've blended those together and we've made our own thing. Kind of a do-it-yourself approach. Now, as they stare into this changing face of American religion, imagine how the theocrats among us must feel. I mean, they're frightened by it, and no wonder, because it is a rebuke to so much of what they stand for. And again, they're their way of dealing with that is interesting. It's not to go back and to self-reflect. It's not to go back and to say, what can we do differently? What can we do better? How can we win over some of these people who are saying these things? It's not to offer a better product. That's not what they're doing. Instead, they're screaming persecution and stepping up their demands for preferential treatment from the government. And I think really what they have missed is a quote by Benjamin Franklin. They would do well to read this and reflect on it. I'm going to read it to you. This is a quote Franklin wrote to a friend, Richard Price, in a letter dated October 9th, 1780. Franklin observed, "When a religion is good, I can see that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself, and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call upon the help of a civil power, it is a sign I apprehend of it being a bad religion." Now that ruling was a blow. The Hobby Lobby ruling was a blow. We have a lot of work to do. Again, frustrating 5-4 decisions. We keep thinking if we could just get a change on the Supreme Court, we could maybe start getting it back in a more separationist direction. But every time I get discouraged about those rulings, I remember how much the theocrats have lost. Think about this for a minute. Again, some of you lived through this stuff. You remember it. How they used to have the power to censor things. Books and magazines and stage plays and movies. Towns used to have censorship boards. Local clergy would approve this stuff. If they didn't approve it, you couldn't see it. When I was young, I used to wonder, people would say, they would joke about a book being banned in Boston. I don't always think, Boston? That's like a cosmopolitan New England city. It's liberal. What's that all about? Well, then I read some history. They used to ban books in Boston. The bishop, powerful Catholic bishops, working in conjunction with some conservative Protestants, had the power to ban books, magazines, stage plays, movies, all this stuff. One phone call was all it took to the DA, and you could have stuff removed that very day. They lost that power. Same-sex marriage. You could see them losing that fight, losing the hearts and minds of the American people. The incredible progress we've made on LGBT rights generally. The freer sexual attitudes, the more accepting role of women in society. Even things like blasphemy laws that they used to have in this country that have fallen by the wayside. They have lost so much. They've lost the power to tell us what to do in many areas of our lives, especially the most intimate and private details of our lives. What did they get in return? Well, they got a courtroom blessing for ceremonial religion before a meeting, and they got the right to have someone stand up in Congress and say a prayer before an empty chamber, and they got the right to stamp "In God We Trust" on a nickel. I don't know that that's ever really brought anybody to a more fuller understanding of Jesus Christ, seeing "In God We Trust" on a nickel, but that's what they got. But they're not going to go down easy. They're not going to stop their efforts to get back all that stuff that they used to have. Because they remember those days, just as we read about them, and we remember them as bad times, unfortunate times, scary times, oppressive times. They look back at them as wonderful times, good times, times when we ruled everything. Of course they'd like to get that power back. Of course they want to return to the days when they told people what to do, when they made moral decisions for people. And the biggest challenge facing us today is no matter how we do it, whether we do it at the ballot box, through the courtroom, through public education, through just talking to people, or some combination of all of those things, the biggest challenge for us is to remember that what they're trying to do. Take Madison's victory and award it to Constantine.